Good evening, and welcome to the next episode of Three Men and a Boat, Chapter 14. Wargrave, Waxworks, Sonning, Our Stew. Montmorency is sarcastic. Flight between Montmorency and the tea kettle. George's banjo studies. Meet with encouragement. Difficulties in the way of musical amateur. Learning to play the bagpipes. Harris feels sad after supper. George and I go for a walk. Return hungry and wet. There is a strangeness about Harris. Harris and the Swans. A remarkable story. Harris has a troubled night. Sit down. Go on, sit down. Sit down. There you go. We caught a breeze after lunch, which took us gently up past Wargrave and Shiplake. Mellowed in the drowsy sunlight of a summer's afternoon, Wargrave, nestled where the river bends, makes a sweet old picture as you pass it, and one that lingers along upon the retina of memory. The George and Dragon at Wargrave boasts a painted sign on one side by Leslie R.A. and on the other by Hodgson of the ilk. Leslie has depicted the fight. Hodgson has imagined the scene after the fight. George, the work done, enjoying his pint of beer. Day, the author of Sandford and Merton, lived, and more to the credit of the place still, was killed at Wargrave. In the church is a memorial to Mrs. Sarah Hill, who bequeathed £1 annually to be divided at Easter between 2 boys and 2 girls who had never been undutiful to their parents, and who had never been known to swear or tell untruths, to steal or to break windows. Fancy giving all of that up for 5 shillings a year. It's not worth it. It is rumoured in the town that once, many years ago, a boy appeared who really never had done these things, or at all events, which is always required, or could be expected, had never been known to do them, and thus won the crown of glory. He was exhibited for 3 weeks afterwards in the town hall under a glass case. What has become of the money since, nobody knows. They say it is always handed over to the nearest waxworks show. Shiplake is a pretty village, but it cannot be seen from the river, being up the hill. Tennyson was married in the Shiplake church. The river up to Sonning winds in and out through many islands, and it is placid, hushed and lonely. Few folks, except at twilight, a pair or 2 of rustic lovers, walk along its banks. 'Arry and Lord Fitznoodle had been left behind at Henley, and dismal, dirty Reading had not yet been reached. It is part of the river in which the dream of bygone days, and vanished forms and faces, and things that have been, but are not, confound them. We got out at Sonning and went for a walk around the river. It is the most fairy tale-like nook in the whole river. It is more like a stage village than one built of bricks and mortar. Every house is smothered in roses, and now, in early June, they were busting forth in clouds of dirty splendour. If you stop at Sonning, put up at the Bull behind the church. It's a veritable picture of an old country inn, with green square courtyards in front, where, on seats beneath the trees, the old men group of an evening to drink their ale and gossip over village politics, with low, quaint rooms and lattice windows, and awkward stairs and winding passages. We roamed about the sweet Sonning for an hour or so, and then, it being too late to push past Reading, we decided to go back onto the Shiplake Islands and put up there for the night. It was still early when we got settled, and George said that as we had plenty of time, it would be a splendid opportunity to try a good slap-up supper. He said he would show us what could be done upriver in the way of cooking, and suggested that with the vegetables and remains of the cold beef and general odds and ends, we should make Irish stew. It seemed a fascinating idea. George gathered wood and made a fire, and Harris and I started peeling the potatoes. I should have never thought that peeling potatoes was such an undertaking. The job turned out to be the biggest thing of its kind I had ever been in. We began cheerfully one night, almost to say skittishly, but our light-heartedness was gone by the time the first potato was finished. The more we peeled, the more peel there seemed to be left on, and by the time we got all the peel off and all eyes out, there was no potato left, at least none worth speaking of. George came and had a look at it. It was about the same size as a peanut. He said, "Oh, what to do? You're wasting them. You must scrape them." So we scraped them, and that was harder work than peeling. They were such an extraordinary shape, potatoes, all bumps and warts and hollows. We worked steadily for 25 minutes and did 4 potatoes. Then we struck. We said we should require the rest of the evening for scraping ourselves. I never saw such a thing as a potato scraping for making a fellow into a mess. It seemed difficult to believe that the potato scrapings, in which Harris and I stood, half smothered, could have come off only 4 potatoes. It shows you what can be done with economy and care. George said it was absurd to have only 4 potatoes in an Irish stew, so we peeled half a dozen or so more and put them in without feeling. We also put in a cabbage and about half a peck of peas. George stirred it all up, and then he said there seemed to be a lot of room spare, and so we overhauled both hampers and picked out all the odds and ends and remnants and added them into the stew. There were half a pork pie and a bit of cold boiled bacon left. We also put them in. Then George found a tin of potted salmon, and he emptied it into the pot. He said this wasn't the advantage of an Irish stew. You got rid of such things. I fished out a couple of eggs that had got cracked, and we put those in. George said they would thicken the gravy. I forget the other ingredients, but I know nothing was wasted, and I remember that towards the end, Montmorency, who had envied great interest in the proceedings throughout, strolled away with an earnest and thoughtful air, reappearing a few minutes afterwards with the dead water rat in his mouth, which he evidently wished to present as his contribution to the dinner. Whether in sarcastic spirit or with a general desire to assist, I cannot say. We had a discussion as to whether the rat should go in or not. Harris said he thought it to be all right, mixed up with the other things, and that every little helped. But George stood up for precedent. He said he'd never heard of a water rat in an Irish stew, and he'd rather be on the safe side and not try experiments. Harris said, "If you never try anything new, how can you tell what it's like? It's men such as you that hamper the world's progress. Think of the man who first tried German sausage." It was a great success, that Irish stew. I don't think I ever enjoyed a meal more. There was something so fresh and piquant about it. One's palate gets so tired of the old hackneyed things. Here was a dish with a new flavour, and with a taste like nothing else on earth. And it was nourishing too. As George said, there was a good bit of stuff in it. The peas and potatoes might have been a bit softer, but we all had good teeth, so it didn't matter much. And as for the gravy, it was a poem. A little too rich, perhaps, for a weak stomach, but nutritious. We finished up with tea and cherry tart. Montmorency had a fight with the kettle during tea time and came off a poor second. Throughout the trip, he had manifested a great curiosity concerning that kettle. He would sit and watch it as it boiled with a puzzled expression, and he would try and rouse it every now and then by growling at it. When it began to splutter and steam, he regarded it as a challenge and would want to fight it. Only at that precise moment, someone would always dash up and bear off his prey before he could get at it. Today he determined he would beforehand. At the first sound the kettle made, he rose, growling, and advanced towards it in a threatening attitude. It was only a little kettle, but it was full of pluck, and it up and spat at him. "Ah, would ye?" growled Montmorency, showing his teeth. "I'll teach you, you Chachika hard-working dog, respectable dog, you miserable, long-nosed, dirty-looking scoundrel, ye come on!" And he rushed at that poor little kettle and seized it by the spout. Then, across that evening stillness, broke a blood-curdling yelp, and Montmorency left the boat, and did a constitutional 3 times around the island at the rate of 35 miles an hour, stopping every now and then to bury his nose in a bit of cool mud. From that day, Montmorency regarded the kettle with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and hate. Whenever he saw it, he would growl and back at a rapid rate, and his tail shut down, and the moment it was put upon the stove, he would promptly climb out of the boat, sit on the bank, and wait until the whole tea business was over. George got out his banjo after supper and wanted to play it, but Harris objected. He said he'd got a headache and did not feel strong enough to stand it. George thought that the music might do him good, and said music often soothed the nerves and took away a headache, and he twanged 2 or 3 notes just to show Harris what it was like. Harris said he'd rather have the headache. George has never learned to play the banjo to this day. He has had too much all-round discouragement to meet. He tried on 2 or 3 evenings whilst we were upriver to get a little practice, but it was never a success. Harris's language used to be enough to unnerve any man, added to which Montmorency would sit and howl steadily right through the performance. It was not giving the man a fair chance. "What do you want to howl like that for when I'm playing?" George would indignantly exclaim whilst taking aim with him at the boot. "What do you want to play like that for when he is howling?" Harris would retort, catching the boot. "You let him alone. He can't help howling. He's got a musical ear, and your playing makes him growl." So George determined to postpone and study the banjo until he reached home. But he did not get much opportunity even there. Mrs. P. used to come up and say she was very sorry. For herself, she liked to hear him, but the lady upstairs was in a very delicate state, and the doctor was afraid it might injure the child. Then Harris tried taking it out with him late at night and practising around the square. But the inhabitants complained to the police about it, and a watch was set for him one night, and he was captured. The evidence against him was very clear, and he was bound over to keep the peace for 6 months. He seemed to lose heart in the business after that. He did make 1 or 2 feeble efforts to take up the work again when the 6 months had elapsed, but there was always the same coldness, the same want of sympathy on the part of the world to fight against, and after a while he despaired altogether and advertised the instrument for sale at a great sacrifice, owner having no further use for same, and took to learning card tricks instead. It must be disheartening learning a musical instrument. You would think society, for its own sake, would do all it could to assist a man to acquire the art of playing a musical instrument, but it doesn't. I knew a young fellow once who was studying to play the bagpipes, and you'd be surprised at the amount of opposition he had to contend with. Why, not even the members of his own family did he receive what you'd call active encouragement. His father was dead against the business from the beginning, and spoke quite unfeelingly on the subject. My friend used to get up early in the morning to practice, but he had to give that plan up because of his sister. She was somewhat religiously inclined, and she said it seemed such an awful thing to begin the day like that. So he sat up at night instead, and played after the family had gone to bed. But that did not do, as it got the house such a bad name. People going home late would stop outside to listen, and then put it about all over town, the next morning, that a fearful murder had been committed at Mr. Jefferson's the night before, and would describe how they heard the victim's shrieks and brutal oaths and curses of murder, followed by the prayer for mercy and the last dying gurgle of the corpse. So they let him practice in the daytime, in the back kitchen, with all the doors shut. But his most successful passage could generally be heard in the sitting room, in spite of those precautions, and the effect was to bring his mother almost to tears. She said it put her in mind of her poor father. He'd been swallowed by a shark, poor man, whilst bathing off the coast of New Guinea. Where the connection came in, she could not explain. Then they knocked up a little place for him at the bottom of the garden, and made him take the machine down there when he wanted to work it. Sometimes a visitor would come to the house who knew nothing about the matter, and they would forget to tell him all about it, and caution him that he would go out for a stroll around the garden, and suddenly within earshot of those bagpipes, without being prepared of it or know what it was. If he were a man of strong mind, it would only give him the fits, but a person of mere average intellect it usually sent mad. There is, it must be confessed, something very sad about the early efforts of the amateur in bagpipes. I have felt that myself when listening to my young friend. They appear to be a trying instrument to perform upon. You have to get enough breath for the whole tune before you start. At least, so I gathered from watching Jefferson. He would begin magnificently with a wild, full, come-to-battle sort of note that quite roused you. But he would get more and more piano as he went on, and the last verse generally collapsed in the middle with a splutter and a hiss. You want to be in good health to play the bagpipes. Young Jefferson only learnt to play one tune on those bagpipes, but I never heard any complaints about the insufficiency of his repertoire, none whatsoever. This tune, "The Campbells are coming, hooray, hooray," so he said, though his father always held it was the Bluebells of Scotland. Nobody seemed quite sure what it was exactly, but they all agreed it sounded Scotch. Strangers were allowed 3 guesses, and most of them guessed a different tune each time. Harris was disagreeable after supper. I think it must have been the stew had upset him. He's not used to high living. So George and I left him in the boat and settled to go for a munch around Henley. He said he would have a glass of whisky and a pipe and fix things for the night. We were to shout when we returned, and he would row over from the island and fetch us. "Don't go to sleep, old man," we said as we started. "Not much fear of that while this stew is on," he grunted as he pulled back to the island. Henley was getting ready for the regatta and was full of bustle. We met a goodish number of men we knew about the town, and in their pleasant company the time slipped by somewhat quickly, so that it was nearly 11 o'clock before we set off on our 4-mile walk home, as we learned to call our little craft by this time. It was a dismal, coldish night, with thin rain falling, and as we trudged through the dark, silent fields, talking low to each other and wondering if we were going right or not, we thought of the cosy boat with the bright light streaming through the tight-drawn canvas, of Harris and Montmorency, and the whisky, and wished that we were there. We conjured up the picture of ourselves inside, tired and a little hungry, of the gloomy river and its shapeless trees, and like a giant glowworm underneath them sat our dear old boat, so snug, warm and cheerful. We could see ourselves at supper there, pecking away at cold meat, and passing each other chunks of bread. We could hear the cheery clatter of our knives and the laughing voices filling through the space and overflowing through the opening out into the night, and we hurried on to realize that vision. We struck the towpath at length, and that made us happy, because prior to this we'd not been sure whether we were walking toward the river or away from it. When you are tired and want to go to bed, uncertainties like that worry you. We passed Ship Lake as the clock was striking 11:45, and George said thoughtfully, "You don't happen to remember which of the islands it was, do you?" "No," I replied, beginning to grow thoughtful too. "I don't. How many are there?" "Only 4, answered George. "It'll be all right, if he's awake." And if not? I queried. But we dismissed that train of thought. We shouted when we came opposite the first island, but there was no response. So we went to the second and tried there, and obtained the same result. "Oh, I remember now," said George. "It was the third one." And we ran over to the third one and hallooed. No answer. The case was becoming serious. It was now past midnight. The hotels at Shiplake and Henley would be crammed, and we could not go round knocking up cottagers and householders in the middle of the night to know if they let apartments. George suggested walking back to Henley and assaulting a policeman, and getting so a night's lodging in the station house. But then there was a thought. Suppose he only hits us back and refuses to lock us up? We could not pass the whole night fighting policemen. Besides, we did not want to overdo the thing and get 6 months. We despairingly tried what seemed in the darkness to be the fourth island, but met with no better success. The rain was coming down fast now, and evidently meant to last. We were wet to the skin and cold and miserable. We began to wonder whether there were only 4 islands or more, and whether we were near the islands at all, or whether we were anywhere within the mile of where we ought to be, or in the wrong part of the river altogether. Everything looked so strange and different in the darkness. We began to understand the suffering of the babes in the wood. Just when we'd given up all hope. Yes, I know that there's always the time that things do happen in novels and tales, but I can't help it. I resolved when I began to write this book that I would be strictly truthful in all such things, and so I will, even if I have to employ a hackneyed phrase for the purpose. It was just when we'd given up all hope, and I must therefore say so. Just when we'd given up all hope, then I suddenly caught sight, a little way below us, of a strange, weird sort of glimmer flickering among the trees on the opposite bank. For an instant I thought of ghosts, it was such a shadowy, mysterious light. The next moment it flashed across me that it was our boat, and I set up such a yell across the water that made the night shake in its bed. We waited breathless for a minute, and then, oh, divinest music in the darkness! We heard the answering bark of Montmorency. We shouted back loud enough to wake the 7 sleepers. I never could understand myself why it should take more noise to wake 7 sleepers than 1, and after what seemed an hour, but was really, I suppose, only about 5 minutes, we saw the lighted boat creeping slowly over the blackness, and heard Harris's sleepy voice asking where we were. There was an unaccountable strangeness about Harris. It was something more than ordinary tiredness. He pulled the boat against part of the bank from which it was quite impossible for us to get into, and then immediately went to sleep. It took us an immense amount of screaming and roaring to wake him up again and put some sense into him, but we succeeded at last and got safely on board. Harris had a sad expression on him, so we noticed when we got into the boat. It gave you the idea of a man who'd been through trouble. We asked him if anything had happened, and he said, "Swans." It seemed we'd moored close to a swan's nest, and soon after George and I had gone, the female swan came back and kicked up a bit of a row about it. Harris had chivered her off, but she'd gone away and fetched up her old man. Harris said he'd had quite a fight with those 2 swans, but courage and skill had prevailed in the end, and he had defeated them. Half an hour afterwards they returned with 18 other swans. It must have been a fearful battle, so far as we could understand Harris's account of it. The swans had tried to drag him and Montmorency out of the boat and drown them, and he had defended himself like a hero for 4 hours, and had killed the lot, and they had all paddled away to die. "How many swans did you say there were?" asked Harris. 32, replied Harris drearily. "You said 18 just now," said George. "No, I didn't," grunted Harris. "I said 12. Think I can't count?" What were the real facts about these swans we never found out. We questioned Harris on the subject in the morning, and he said, "What swans?" and seemed to think George and I had been dreaming. Oh, how delightful it was to be safe in the boat, after our trials and fears. We ate a hearty supper, George and I, and we should have had some toddy after it, if we could have found whisky, but we could not. We examined Harris as to what he had done with it, but he did not seem to know what we were meant by whisky, or what we were talking about at all. Montmorency looked as if he knew something, but said nothing. I slept well that night, and should have slept better had it not been for Harris. I have a vague recollection of having been woken several times during the night by Harris, wandering about in the boat with his lantern, looking for his clothes. He seemed to be worrying about his clothes all night. Twice he rounded up George and myself to see if we were lying on his trousers. George got quite wild the second time. "What on thunder do you want your trousers for in the middle of the night?" he asked indignantly. "Why don't you just lie down and go to sleep?" I found him in trouble next time I awoke, because he could not find his socks, and my last hazy remembrance is of being rolled over on my side and hearing Harris muttering something about being an extraordinary thing where his umbrella could have gotten to. That's a slightly bizarre end to chapter 14. So, we're nearly finished on the book now, and I hope you're enjoying things so far, and I'll bid you good night. There may be some people who find the reading here slightly odd, but I'm using it as an effective method as well as providing for my nephew. I'm also finding it an effective way of learning how to use the cameras in what I might term a safe environment. So thank you very much for joining me so far on this journey, and I hope that you'll continue to like and subscribe to the videos, and hopefully you've seen a good improvement in the quality of the content in terms of the camera work. So thank you, and good night.